Hi, I'm Matt here in Michigan.
And I'm Randall here in Texas. So, a couple weeks back, Matt and I are filming our call up episode for sequels and what makes a good sequel. And at the very end, I mentioned to Matt, like, hey, I got through this whole thing and I didn't mention Star Trek once. And then Matt's like, wait a minute, we didn't talk about Wrath of Khan. It's one of the best sequels of all time. And I'm like, I didn't do it on purpose. And then Matt's like, you know what? I kind of want to go back and watch all six of the original movies. And I'm like, I'll do that. So for the next 6 weeks, well, next 5 weeks if you're watching this one, we're going to be going back and doing the Star Trek original crew motion picture set. We're starting with Star Trek, the motion picture. It's pretty well known that I'm going to like this film. Matt and I have both seen it. It's not like it's his first time watching it. But Matt, what do you think of it?
It's pretty good. I mean, whenever you get to see, the original, Kirk and the crew, I mean, it's a good time. I wouldn't say the motion picture is my favorite of the Kirk, Star Trek movies, but it's enjoyable and stuff too. It is definitely pretty to look at. I mean, you're thinking this movie came out in what '79, just like 2 years after Star Wars and stuff. This is a pretty movie to look at. The backdrops and stuff, the ships and stuff. Granted, some of it wasn't necessarily meant to be seen in like HD or whatever on your big screen TV, but it still is really good. I mean, you keep that in context and stuff. It's good, and it does well with the characters, and there's a good story in this movie talking about the characters.
This film really is about the characters. It is a special effects like bonanza as well, but it's not special effects in the way Star Wars is special effects. It's more like here's this great amazing vastness of space and this great amazing vastness of this device that's coming to Earth called V'ger, and we're just going to show it off in all of its amazing size. Like the Enterprise uses a known quantity how big she is as a ship, and V'ger dwarfs the Enterprise. And then you just have these crew members. You have Kirk, you have Spock, you have Bones, Decker in this, and Ilea. Decker and Ilea are a thing, and it's all about them and their journey and V'ger's journey and coming together at the end. The right people in the right place at the right time, basically. Uh, it's it's not like any other Star Trek movie. If you watch any other Star Trek movie and then you watch this one, it's it's the one that's obviously different than everything else. It was meant to be like the Gene Roddenberry's 2001, and for me, it's fun to watch, but I can understand how some people don't like it, and it's definitely probably pretty boring if you're a kid.
Well, this movie has a runtime of like 2 hours and 25 minutes, and a lot of that is showing these wide, I don't know, long, wide panning shots and stuff of like the Enterprise stuff. And I think that's one thing too. The pacing could use the maybe a little bit picked up. Like it's a 2 hour and 25 minute movie, and probably could be less than 2 hours for sure.
The introduction of the Enterprise in this movie, and it's had a refit, an 18-month refit. Um, it's a completely new ship though.
Randall, I timed it. I think it's like 4 minutes and 45 seconds long. Yeah, you see the ship, and then you'll see like Kirk and Scotty, like looking at each other, like smiling, kind of thing, and like looking at the ship, and it's like, all right, we get it, kind of thing. Like we could have cut this like in half, kind of thing. It was almost like we take all this video and stuff for like cutaways and stuff too, but the filmmakers are like, you know what? We're gonna use it all. We're gonna use all the film. We're not getting rid of any of this stuff that we shot. We're gonna put it all in the film, so you get to see the whole thing.
There's a reason for it from the concept of you have the 1960s show, and there's the Enterprise, and it's the Enterprise that everyone knows. And now they've redesigned the Enterprise or refit it, and it's showing the audience around this new ship. But as much as it's showing the audience around, Kirk doesn't know this new ship. He goes on the ship, and and there's moments where he stops and he's like, I have to think, and there's a moment when he has to ask like an ensign, which way is this? And Decker, who's been in charge of the entire refit and was really hoping to get promoted to be the captain of this vessel, he notices that, and he just gives Kirk like a, that like disappointing parent look almost, like, you don't know this ship. This is not your ship anymore at this point. So there's a reason for like the big, huge, long introduction of it. But at the same time, yes, could they have cut it down? Absolutely. The point was made.
It's a big part about Kirk and the ship kind of thing. I mean, Kirk kind of, I don't know what you want to say, not weasels his way, but basically kind of found a way to get himself back at the helm of the Enterprise. And a lot of this movie kind of looks at her characters and is like, all right, what are their real motivations? Because at the beginning, Kirk is like, hey, we need to get going. There's, V'ger isn't that far off. We need to get there as quickly as we can, and we're the closest ship. The world is is counting on us. Federation, everything is counting on us. Earth is counting on us. We need to get there before it gets to Earth. And everyone's kind of questioning, like, all right, for those who know Kirk, it's like, all right, we believe in Kirk. He has our best intentions. But there's really that question is like, all right, Kirk, is this more about doing the mission, or is this your, more about your ambitions to be the captain of those Enterprise? Because the Enterprise is not really ready to go out, the ship, not the crew. I mean, I think there's a big distinction between the crew of the Enterprise and the ship of the Enterprise. The ship isn't necessarily ready to go out yet. And we see the consequences of that early, where two crew members, die in the transporter and stuff too. And it's basically makes you reflect. It's like, are we pushing this too hard, kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, we have that with Kirk, and a little bit later I'll talk about like Spock too, because I think Spock kind of has the same arc in this movie as well.
Yeah, so it's even mentioned. So Bones, who's like the emotional center of the film, he brings people back to. He says like, Kirk, you're pushing everything. Jim, you're pushing everybody, and Jim as captain, or admiral in this case, he just expects everyone to follow his orders and do what is said, and we got to get this done. But Bones isn't just his subordinate. Bones is his friend. And he's like, and we're going to sit down and we're going to have a conversation and we're going to talk about this. And the same thing with Spock. Bones is that emotional center for Spock's character as well, where Spock is the extreme opposite, no emotion, and Kirk is super emotional, and Bones is just in the middle, and he's just like, oh my God, you got to have more emotion about all of this. And he's telling Kirk, well, you got to recognize where we're at right now and how the crew's feeling right now. I absolutely love Bones as a character, and I do love DeForest Kelly's portrayal of him, especially like in this film. Everything starts off and like the characters are they've gone on with their lives. Bones is out of Starfleet. Captain Kirk is not a captain; he's an admiral now. Spock's out of Starfleet. Spock went to go do the Kolinar and pursue ultimate logic. Everyone's moved on, and then we get to bring the band back together.
Kirk brings the band back together. Spock just happened to be it, but I think that's kind of funny too, because that is real important too. One of the biggest scenes is when Kirk gets Bones on the ship, kind of thing, and he reveals to Bones that the so-called loophole that got him drafted back on the Enterprise, it was Kirk himself who was behind pointing out
some
this loophole.
Admiral at Starfleet enacted a little known
me I'm that admiral kind of thing. But what makes it great is is that moment that Kirk has with Bones when he looks at Bones, is like, Bones, I need you. And he kind of has that reflective, and then he knows Kirk better than anyone, so he really knows what Kirk means. Like, you could sometimes take Kirk by like face value or whatever, basically what he says. But I think Bones really gets the meaning and stuff in Kirk's words, and I liked it. That was, to me, that was one of the most important, I would say, parts or scenes in that film.
Yeah, and it's really fun to see Quarantine Beard McCoy He's just got this giant beard. It's a lot of fun. And so the Enterprise is moving on, and it's going on, and they don't even have warp drive, like you mentioned. The ship's not even ready for warp drive, and Kirk pushes it, and
Yeah, it causes a wormhole
well,
for trying to go through like warp.
which is kind of a weird. They just didn't know the science at the time, so like I'm sure if they did this movie exactly the same, except for that they wouldn't use the word wormhole. And there's an asteroid in the wormhole, so that's kind of weird. So
can't crash into the asteroid. If we try to get Randall, we'll create another wormhole.
Yeah, but so there is a really interesting spot in this movie, and it just demonstrates again that Kirk doesn't really know the ship, where he's like ordering the destruction of the asteroid, and there's a difference between like using phasers versus using photon torpedo, because during the refit they tied the phasers into the warp capabilities of the ship in order to increase their power, so you have to use a proton torpedo or else you would blow the entire ship up. And Decker saves everyone, because if they had done what Kirk wanted, the ship would have blown up, V'ger would have come and destroyed Earth, etc. Movie done. How it should have ended.
And that's the thing too. Kirk kind of took that as, like questioning his orders kind of thing. He brings Decker and Bones into the Ray Room. It's kind of interesting. Kirk didn't actually Bones, but Bones kind of knew. He's like, I'm coming along on this talk between the two of you. Like you said, that center, that balance, to point out to Kirk that, hey, he may be right, and he saved, so you gotta think of that too. Don't. It's not necessarily his ego, or Decker's ego, even though Decker's ego was a little bruised by not being able to take over the Enterprise, but it's more about like Kirk, and that's what Bones is trying to tell him, is like, don't let that get in the way of the crew, the crew's safety.
Yeah, and it's one of those fun things where Bones doesn't even ask permission. He's like, I'm coming, yeah, go ahead, try and stop me. What are you gonna do? It is this movie is full of like, it moves from scene to scene, like you said, the pacing's a little bit slow, but it moves from scene to scene, and it's like characters, and then you have characters interacting. There's not that much outside of like the Enterprise inside of V'ger that's not character driven. This is a very character driven movie. It's really about these characters that we grew up with. Well, I wasn't alive when the movies even came out, but these characters that you've grown to love, kind of figuring out how things are now, getting back together, doing the right thing, and then after the wormhole incident, Spock finally shows up. We're like an hour into the movie, and now Spock's here! Yay!
Spock was meant to be there. Spock, when I was younger, he was probably my favorite character. I think my opinions and stuff have changed a little bit, but I was mentioned like Spock's character, and you were saying too, it was so big on him being like devoid of like emotions and stuff. You were mentioning that, and that's kind of like the thing that we get at the end. It's kind of like to tell Spock, that for V'ger, that was what V'ger needed to take the next step, was to have human emotions and stuff, because it could only think logically, and it couldn't think of like other possibilities or whatever that are unlogical and stuff, and it needed that human element, that human emotion element to, I don't know what you want to say, evolve or whatever, to take the next step kind of thing. And I think that's kind of like the arc that like Spock takes in this movie, because it's kind of interesting too. We were talking about like Kirk really acting in the best interest, the crew were pushing him, and then we quickly shifted like, what is Spock's motivations? Is Spock just gonna leave the crew, on their own kind of thing, so that he can go and seek the knowledge or whatever about this entity, this V'ger?
V'ger is there as a parallel to Spock's character, like Bones is there almost as a parallel to Kirk's character, and Decker, to be fair. He does, there's some shady motivations. If you've never seen the movie, you're kind of questioning, well, okay, is Spock here to help Kirk and the crew, or is Spock here for his own motivations, for his own reasons? Now, if you are watching it in hindsight, you're like, well, okay, come on, it's Spock. But if you've never seen it before, you're kind of questioning it, or if you had just seen it like in theaters in 1979, it's the first thing you've seen new Star Trek since the animated series was on the air, which is not canon, by the way. Just saying. You can go in and be like, all right, well, I understand that Spock, the character, is in a different spot than he was when we last left him off, and I don't know if I can trust him like I used to be able to trust him. They did a very good job of portraying that, and they don't do it crazy. They just they just let it play out as though he's just maybe is, maybe isn't.
No, it does a good job. Yeah, I mean, you see Spock, and you see how Spock reacts to the crew, and you see how like the crew reacts to Spock. Like they're all excited to see him, and Spock is just kind of like, I'm just here to do something kind of thing. And then you go, a lot of it's between Kirk and Bones again, where they're questioning, kind of thing, like what Spock is one of our friends, even though I don't know if Bones would admit that Spock is. But it's kind of like we think we're close
you
to Spock,
green-blooded Vulcan.
We don't know. You green-blooded Vulcan, exactly. Cold-hearted, green-blooded Vulcan.
The interplay, the communication between Spock and McCoy. Oh my god. You can insult him all you want, McCoy. He doesn't care.
One thing I want to bring up, there's a big difference between like the ship, the Enterprise, and the crew, the Enterprise. One thing that you mentioned, that this was the right people at the right place at the right time. And that's that big element, is because it's the crew of the Enterprise. That's why Kirk wanted to bring the band together, because he knows the strength in the Enterprise is the crew and not the ship. It's the crew that can go through all these, problems of the ship not working and stuff, and, coming up with the solution when, at the last moment or whatever, when it seems like, we're like doomed kind of thing too. And I think that was a good thing that they really, for a Star Trek focused film or whatever, to actually focus on the crew and stuff of that, have that be the highlight. It's a good way to have a first movie in like the Star Trek series.
So, stepping back away from the actual what's happening in the movie for a moment. This is pretty much the most unadulterated Star Trek vision of Gene Roddenberry's. He had a lot of say in this movie. He had a lot of say in the script. He had a lot of say in the production, which is something that's going to be talked about next week when we talk about Wrath of Khan, because lots changed between this film and that film. The crew, Gene Roddenberry was adamant. Gene Roddenberry would hate Discovery. He would absolutely despise Star Trek Discovery. He was adamant that the crew get along, that the crew work together. We're past our petty arguments, If we work together and we use our technology, we can overcome anything. This movie embodies that. It is about the crew. It is about these characters. We all know each other's strengths, and we're going to work to do the right thing and accomplish our task. That's Star Trek the Motion Picture in a nutshell.
Yep. Even the characters that we questioned, our faith and belief in those characters is reaffirmed at the end, kind of thing. That story arc, connection of the crew and stuff, it's back.
Yep, it's back, and honestly, this is one of those moments that almost killed Star Trek. Because this film was not super well received. I mean, yeah, you had like your hardcore fans that definitely enjoyed it. I mean, and I think it's more well respected now than it was when it came out, in all honesty. And that's not just because of the more divisive way that Star Trek has gone recently. I just think that it's taken some time for people to appreciate the characters and the way they were written in this film and the growth. This movie ages well, in my opinion.
Yep, I think the only thing I would say is, like, for us, we already knew like the characters and stuff. It might be a hard introduction to people that really. I mean, I don't know how if you're living under a rock or whatever, you don't know anything about Captain Kirk or Spock or anything. But if you don't, I could see it could be a little bit hard for some people to get into. But if you're already like a fan of Star Trek, or even know like even some of like the newer movies and stuff, I think this is a good movie to definitely go check out. But no, it's a little different. It's not gonna be your fast paced. I mean, for coming like 2 years after Star Wars, it's not Star Wars. Don't watch this expecting Star Wars. This is Star Trek. You're gonna come watching Star Trek.
I mean, to be fair, this movie only got made because of Star Wars. Thank you, Star Wars. They're planning at this time. They're planning Star Trek Phase 2, which is supposed to be a reboot of sorts, or not really a reboot, but a continuation of Star Trek. It's supposed to be on TV. And then Star Wars happens. Star Wars comes out in theaters, and it's a huge, massive hit, 1977. And Paramount's just like, well, what do we got that takes place in space, you know? And they're like, well, we got Star Trek. And, you know, we're already in the process of making a new TV series called Star Trek Phase 2. And basically they just plucked what would have been the pilot storyline from Star Trek Phase 2, and they blew it up into a movie size script. And that's why you have Decker. Decker was supposed to be introduced as the new first officer because, we'll call him Proto Will Riker, honestly. Because Leonard Nimoy wasn't interested in reprising the role on a TV series. He was done with Spock at that point, and he only came back because it was a movie, honestly. But yeah, big thank you to Star Wars. And then Star Trek came out, and everyone's like, well, this isn't anything like Star Wars.
No, it's not. And I'm glad for it, too. We have our Star Wars, we have our Star Trek, and I like them for their differences and stuff.
Yeah, it's fun. And then just to get towards the end of the movie, so at the end of this film, you discover the secret of V'ger. V'ger's this giant conglomeration all built around Voyager 6, which is a probe that doesn't even exist in real life. But you got to remember, when it came out, we were constantly sending probes out into, NASA was just sending Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, and just, we had tons of hope for our space travel futures at the time.
It's just like Back to the Future's mention of Jaws, like Jaws whatever number, just add another number on the end. Voyager, just add another number on the end.
But so we get to the end, and what ends up happening is again, a very bad, this reference doesn't think, goes, it disappeared into what we used to call a black hole, and it's like, oh god. Earlier you used wormhole wrong, and now you're calling a black hole a wormhole, at least our understanding of worm. So that hasn't aged very well, but so Voyager 6 disappears, and it gets transported boku far away, and I always thought, well, it'd be kind of fun if that was the Borg that did it, but the Borg wouldn't do that. But basically, it lands someplace where there's a hyper-sentient, machine race. And Voyager has a simple programming. It says, take information in, transport it back to my creators. And their creators on Earth. And the super advanced AI race of mechanicals builds an entire ship around Voyager just so it can complete its mission. Which is kind of cool. It's like, keep cataloging everything that you possibly can, and we'll give you the ability to do that. And we'll give you the ability to get all of that information back to your creator. But somewhere along the way, it's compiled so much information that it became sentient.
Yeah, V'ger, Voyager, which I always thought was kind of interesting. The reason they called it V'ger was because part of the letters were like scraped off or covered up kind of thing or whatever.
It's actually kind of funny because it's like, it's like some carbon scarring and we're all called carbon units to the machine. And it's like, you get your name because you have carbon scarring on your nameplate. Take that. But basically, Matt had kind of already mentioned it. V'ger or Voyager becomes sentient, and it doesn't want to just complete its mission. It wants to take the next step in its evolution. It knows that, like, once it delivers its vast quantity of data, that's it. That's the end of its line. And it doesn't want that. It wants to go on. It needs to go on. It wants to be something greater than what it was programmed to be originally. And it gets that in the form of Decker sacrificing himself to the machine and allowing Kirk, Spock, and McCoy to escape to safety on the Enterprise. And then, for all intents and purposes, Voyager ascends. It now has the capability to imagine. It's like, I have all of this information, I have all of this technology, but I lacked the knowledge of what to do with it. And with the human components that it can get from Decker, it says, now I can go on and I can be whatever I want. And that's how the film ends. And Bones is just like, it's Bones and Kirk who are like, did we just deliver a baby? A new species form? And he's like, yeah. And Bones says, it's been a long time since I've delivered a new life form or something like that. Yep. So, and then you just get the crew sailing off on the ship, on the Enterprise,
That's the thing too. I mean, that's what I like about Star Trek. I like the exploration. That's what I like, and it's a great ending for me because it's like, we're gonna go exploring. There's the Enterprise mission of exploring, find new worlds and stuff. We're gonna continue that on, kind of thing. So for me, that was a great ending. We got the crew back together, and we're gonna do some more exploring.
And it's good. And that's not exactly where they go with the sequel, but you guys can wait for that. As mentioned at the beginning of this, it really is a fantastic sequel, but it's very different from your typical sequels, which is why I didn't really want to talk about it in our sequel discussion that we already have. If you haven't checked that out, make sure to check that out. Post a link. But Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan takes a completely different direction than Star Trek: The Motion Picture. But I'm happy that they're so separate, and I'm happy that we got what we got here. It's an emotional film. It's a lot of fun to go back and watch, especially if you're willing to imagine along with the movie. It wants you to be awed. It wants you to have that, like I said, that 2001 feeling to it, where everything's just big and grandiose. It's got big ideas.
Yep, for sure. Very pretty, very visual and stuff of this movie. Randall and I, we want to know what you think about Star Trek. Like we were saying, stay here. We got much more Star Trek films coming on. Wrath of Khan be coming out next week. If you like our review of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, sure to give us a like and subscribe to see other stuff. Also, ring the bell to get notification when our new videos are on. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook page. We will give you a heads up the day before of the videos that are coming out the next day. So be sure to check us out there and give us some comments, and too, tell us what you guys like and what stuff you'd like to see Randall and I review next. For now, I'm Matt in Michigan. See you guys.
And I'm Randall here in Texas. Everyone have a great day.
Next time on No Market Media. Please consider checking out some of our other videos.